All right, so today we're looking at something, well, pretty wild. We're diving into a sentence, just one sentence, but it's packed with so much like symbolism. It's almost overwhelming. Like, okay, imagine this, a cliff, right? But it's made of chocolate cake. And on top, a czar, just frozen in time. Oh, and did I mention the spectrograph of feelings? It's like someone mashed up a fairy tale with, like, a Black Mirror episode.
It's a really fascinating combination of genres, you're right. And the source material uses this strange mix, this sort of absurdity, to comment on things that are very real, very relevant.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's got me hooked. So, okay, let's start with this gnarled cliff of chocolate cake. Where do we even begin with that? I mean, on the one hand, it sounds delicious, right? But then there's this creepy undertone, like what's lurking inside that cake?
I think that's the beauty of magical realism, right? You take something ordinary, like in this case a cliff, and you blend it with something so fantastical, chocolate cake, and suddenly you're in a world where anything feels possible. It's a technique authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Isabel Allende have used to create these incredibly vivid, thought-provoking stories.
Right. It's like the rules of reality get a little, I don't know, flexible. And speaking of things that are a little off, we've got this czar frozen in time just perched on top of this cake cliff. That just adds another layer of weirdness, don't you think?
Definitely. And I think it's important to consider what czars represent historically. They represent absolute power, right? This sort of untouchable authority. But the fact that this czar is frozen, that suggests stagnation. Like it's a system of control that's incapable of adapting or moving forward.
Oh, I see where you're going with that. Okay, so then we get this line. It's a doozy. On this caramel-covered earth, everyone who ate tasted art in every bite.
So is this where the spectrograph of feelings comes into play? Is it like analyzing those art-tasting experiences? It's a great question, and it brings us to, I think, a really crucial point, the intersection of food and power. And it's not just any food here. We're talking about chocolate cake, caramel, these things that are associated with indulgence and pleasure, even decadence.
So you're saying it's using our desire for pleasure, our craving for something sweet, to control us?
In a way, yes. Remember that AI analysis we discussed, the one that highlighted food as a powerful political metaphor? I think this is a perfect example of that in action, this kind of caramel wonder that seems to be like ruling over everything. It's using something as simple as food to, well, to exert its influence.
Okay, see, now that's way more sinister than my usual late-night cravings. But how does this caramel wonder, how does it actually exert control? Is it through the art in each bite? Is that the mechanism?
Well, think about it this way. The act of eating something so basic, so primal, right? It becomes intertwined with this all-seeing force. You know, it's not just that food is art in this scenario. It's that someone or something is controlling the experience of consuming that art, you know?
That actually makes me think of those, like, hyper-targeted food ads we see online all the time. Are those trying to manipulate our desires? Like, is that what's happening there, too?
It's a chilling thought, right? And I think, in a way, this text is holding up this kind of funhouse mirror to our own world, to how algorithms track our online behavior, what we click on, what we search for, all to predict what we might want, what we might crave. But this story, this sentence, it takes that concept to a whole other level. And it's kind of unsettling, to say the least.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it, about the hidden forces shaping our desires. But, okay, let's dig into the next layer of this sentence, the part that honestly gave me chills. Feelings were fixed and reflected. What does that even mean in this world of, like, chocolate cliffs and art you can taste?
This is where I think this story takes a turn. It goes from being whimsical and strange to something, I don't know, a bit more unsettling, you know? The AI analysis we did actually flagged this phrase as a kind of turning point, like a shift from magical realism to something that feels, I don't know, more dystopian, more like a commentary on the dangers of technology and surveillance.
Dystopian, like, are you saying our feelings are being monitored, manipulated? Is that what fixed and reflected means?
It's definitely open to interpretation, but yeah, I think that's a valid reading, especially when you consider that the next part of the sentence mentions this data, this feeling data, being valuable to private entities and governments. That definitely brings up some concerns about who has access to our inner lives and what they might do with that information.
Okay, now I'm picturing, like, a mood ring, but on a massive scale. Instead of just changing color, the spectrograph of feelings is sending data to corporations and governments. It's giving me some serious Black Mirror vibes.
Right. And it's not just about knowing if you're feeling happy or sad. It's suggesting a much deeper level of analysis, a way of fixing emotions, as if they're just data points to be captured and I don't know, controlled maybe.
So it's not enough that our food choices might be influenced, but now our feelings are being monitored, analyzed, turned into commodities. Suddenly, that saying, data is the new oil, it takes on a whole new meaning. It's more like data is the new oxygen, something we need to survive, but that can also be used to, well, to control us, to limit our freedom.
And just like with oil, there are those who stand to profit from controlling this valuable resource in this case, our emotions, our inner lives. And I think this text is pointing to that very real dynamic, how both private companies and governments are, well, in a way, vying for control, blurring the lines between corporate surveillance and state power.
That blurring of lines is what I find so unsettling. Like, first, it's targeted ads, right? But then where does it go from there? Personalized news feeds designed to make us feel a certain way, to manipulate our opinions. Where does it end?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But I think it's important to remember that this text, it's not just some far-off dystopia. It's holding up a mirror to the world we live in right now. Think about how much of our lives, our emotions, are already being quantified, commodified. Social media platforms track our likes and shares to determine what content we see. Sentiment analysis tools gauge public opinion on everything from products to political candidates. Our feelings are already being mined for data. This story just, takes it to a more fantastical and unsettling extreme.
Yeah, I guess you're right. The seeds are already there. But there's this one line that really stuck with me, different kingdoms of earth. It suggests that this isn't just happening in one place, right? This control, this emotional surveillance, it's everywhere.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important point. The story isn't limited by geographical boundaries or cultural differences. These concerns about surveillance, about the erosion of privacy and autonomy, they're universal.
I don't know about you, but it's kind of bleak, right? This idea that even our feelings, our inner worlds, are becoming just another thing to be bought and sold on a global scale. Makes you want to chuck your phone in a river and disappear off the grid.
Definitely tempting.
Yeah.
But like with a lot of things, I think the answer isn't about giving up technology entirely. It's more about understanding how it's being used, and figuring out ways to reclaim our own agency.
Right. Running and hiding isn't really a solution.
Right.
But how do we even start to push back against something this big, this pervasive? It's like this caramel wonder has its, fingers in everything.
I think awareness is key. This sentence, this story, as weird as it might seem, it forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths, right? We need to be more than just consumers. We need to be critical consumers of information and technology. Ask yourself, who benefits from my data? What could happen if I just hand over my emotions to algorithms?
So it's about being really conscious about what we consume, how we interact with technology, not just letting ourselves be, I don't know, swept along by this tide of targeted content.
Exactly. It's about being active participants in shaping this digital landscape, not just passive consumers. And that takes effort. You have to think critically, ask tough questions, demand more transparency from the companies and the institutions that collect and analyze all this data.
Wow, you've given me a lot to think about today, that's for sure. We started with a sentence about a chocolate cake cliff and ended up talking about the future of freedom in a digital age. It's amazing how one sentence, when you really dig into it, can open up these huge, important questions.
It's the power of art. It can be so sneaky, right? It seems whimsical, even absurd sometimes, and then it hits you with these ideas, these truths you might never have considered otherwise.
I love that. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for how art, even in its strangest forms, can help us understand the world around us. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you find yourself enjoying a little something sweet, you might pause and, I don't know, consider that delicate balance between pleasure and control, between technology and what it means to be human.